The forest was dying. December 19th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, and the Ardennes seemed frozen in time itself. Technical Sergeant Marcus Sullivan lay beneath his M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, watching through a fog periscope as death approached in the form of 14 German vehicles. 22 years old from Nebraska, and at this moment the only thing standing between a German armored column and disaster for 12,000 American soldiers. Through the blurred lens, he counted them again. 1 Tiger E heavy tank leading, 4 Panzer IV medium tanks, 3 half-tracks with infantry, support vehicles bringing up the rear. They moved down the narrow forest road toward Clerf Crossroads with mechanical precision, unaware they were driving into the perfect trap of their own making. Sullivan's hands trembled inside his gloves. The cold had reached -20°C, turning metal into something that burned to touch. His notebook, the one his mother Dorothy had sent, that still smelled of her cinnamon bread, lay open beside him. In it, he had sketched the German formation, calculated distances, noted wind speed. Everything a good soldier should do when ordered to observe and report. Except Sullivan could not report. The radio produced only static, and he had explicit orders not to fire. 3 days earlier, Captain William Hartley had made it clear in a bombed farmhouse near Wiltz. No one fires without confirmation from command. I don't care if Hitler himself drives past. You do not engage without orders. The room had erupted. Lieutenant James Crawford had stood so fast his chair fell. Sir, that's insane. If we see targets of opportunity... Lieutenant, in the past week, friendly fire killed 47 Americans. 47. Our own guns killed more of us than the Germans. Division would rather lose a tactical opportunity than another platoon to misidentification. Whoa. The order was crystal clear. Observation positions observe. They do not engage. Violation meant court-martial. Now Sullivan watched those orders about to cost everything. The Clerf Crossroads controlled the only paved road network in this sector. If the Germans took it, they would cut off the entire 28th Infantry Division. 12,000 soldiers would be isolated, surrounded, destroyed. The mathematics were simple and terrible. Sullivan had not intended to become a soldier. Growing up in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, his world had been measured in acres of wheat and shadows that told time. His father, Charles, fixed farm equipment. His mother taught 8th grade mathematics, coming home with chalk dust on her dress. Even as a boy, Sullivan saw the world through angles and equations. Where friends saw a grain silo, he saw a cylinder whose volume could be calculated. When others built slingshots for fun, Marcus built one with pulleys and counterweights, calculating launch angles on paper before testing them. He enlisted in 1942 for the technical training the engineering courses promised. What he got was 6 weeks learning to operate an M10 Wolverine. His first combat in Normandy had taught him that war was not about luck or courage. It was about patterns. He had watched Danny Rodriguez burn alive in a half-track. Bobby Chen stepped on an American mine outside St. Lo, mismarked on their own maps. After that, Sullivan stopped believing in anything except mathematics. He began carrying the notebook everywhere, sketching German vehicles, noting vulnerable points, calculating optimal firing angles. His crew had survived 4 months that killed 60% of their battalion. Tony Kowalski, 19 from Chicago, spotted targets. Frank Morrison, 24 from Detroit, could load a shell in under 4 seconds. Pete Wilson, 21 from Oregon, could make the 30-ton M10 dance through impossible terrain. Together, they had developed a rhythm that transcended words. But this morning, they were not a crew. They were 4 men watching disaster approach and forbidden to stop it. The German column moved with textbook precision, perfect intervals, standard deployment. It was also fatally flawed. The forest road was a natural bottleneck, steep banks on either side. If the lead vehicle was disabled, the others would stack up behind. If the rear was hit, retreat was cut off. And if someone was smart about which vehicles to target in which order, Sullivan's mind ran calculations automatically. The third vehicle, a Panzer IV, sat at a curve in the road. Destroy it there, and its burning hull would block everything behind while preventing the lead vehicles from backing past the curve. The 7th vehicle, a half-track, carried external fuel cans. Hit those and fire would spread to the ammunition truck behind it. The 10th vehicle, a fuel tanker, would turn the rear into an inferno. 3 shots in the right sequence, and the entire column would be trapped. Sarge, Tony whispered. "They're almost at the crossroads." Sullivan looked at his notebook's last page. His mother had written, "My dear Marcus, remember the right choice is rarely the easy one. Trust yourself. Do what's right." The Tiger tank was now 500 yards away. In 60 seconds, it would pass their position. In 3 minutes, the crossroads. In 10 minutes, the destruction of the 28th Infantry would begin. Sullivan whispered, "Forgive me, Captain." Then, loader armor piercing. Frank Morrison slammed the shell home without hesitation. "AP up." Tony called wind and distance. Pete ready to move. Sullivan settled behind the gun sight, elevated 12 degrees, traversed left to lead the 3rd Panzer, and fired. The shell struck exactly where aimed. The Panzer exploded into a pillar of fire, its turret spinning off like a coin. The German column reacted like disturbed ants. The Tiger tried to reverse but slammed into the Panzer behind it. Infantry jumped from half-tracks. "Pete, move," Sullivan commanded. Wilson lurched the M10 left through underbrush. 5 yards, just enough to present a different angle. Morrison loaded the next shell. Sullivan found the 7th vehicle, the half-track, with fuel cans. The second shot created an instant inferno that engulfed vehicle and infantry alike. Burning fuel spread across the road toward the ammunition truck. Captain Klaus Zimmermann in the Tiger grabbed his radio. Multiple American guns, 6 to 8 enemy positions. He was catastrophically wrong. The speed and accuracy of fire, the different angles, the precise target selection, all suggested a coordinated ambush by a full platoon. Machine gunners fired at empty forest. Tank turrets rotated frantically, seeking targets that didn't exist. Sullivan's 3rd shot hit the fuel tanker. 5,000 gallons erupted in a volcanic demonstration of chemistry meeting violence. The fireball rose 100 feet. Trees burst into flame. The ammunition truck began cooking off in cascading explosions. The road was now impassable. The German column was cut into 3 segments, the Tiger and 1 Panzer trapped at front. 4 vehicles in the middle between walls of fire. Rear support elements blocked by their own jackknife truck. Inside the Tiger, Zimmermann realized the terrible truth. One gun, it's one American gun. But finding one concealed tank destroyer in a forest while your column burns is like finding a specific snowflake in a blizzard. Meanwhile, Sullivan continued his deadly mathematics. 4th shot, the lead Panzer trying to push past the original wreck. 5th shot, a half-track attempting to ram through burning debris. The Germans were no longer a formation, but chaos incarnate. Infantry ran in all directions. Tank crews abandoned vehicles not yet hit. Even the mighty Tiger was reduced to impotent rotation, seeking targets that materialized only in muzzle flash, then vanished. By 7:20 minutes after the first shot, 14 German vehicles had become 14 burning wrecks scattered along a quarter-mile of road. The Tiger sat abandoned, its crew having fled rather than burn alive. Sullivan watched them go through his periscope. He could have shot them. It would have been easy justified. But Sullivan was not interested in killing men. He was interested in solving the mathematical problem of stopping a German advance. The problem was solved. "Cease fire," he said quietly. The sudden silence was almost painful. Smoke drifted through trees, carrying the acrid smell of burning metal and fuel. Tony Kowalski removed his headset with trembling hands. "Jesus, Sarge, we just saved the crossroads. We also just violated direct orders." Frank Morrison laughed without humor. "Court-martial, we took out an entire column. By violating orders," Sullivan repeated, beginning to sketch the aftermath in his notebook, creating evidence that would either hang or exonerate him. At 7:45, the 28th Infantry Division's reconnaissance arrived, expecting to find Germans controlling the crossroads. Instead, they found Hell's Own Barbecue and 1 M10 sitting like a satisfied predator. Captain Robert Mitchell surveyed the destruction with disbelief. "Who did this?" "Sergeant Sullivan, 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, sir." "What unit size engaged?" Sullivan looked at his crew. "1 M10, sir. Just us." Mitchell stared at the burning column, then back at Sullivan. "That's impossible." "Yes, sir, but there it is." Word spread through the reconnaissance element. Soldiers gathered, staring with awe and disbelief. Someone started calling it the Ghost Battery, the phantom American unit that had destroyed an entire German column. Sullivan sat against the M10's tracks, documenting everything in his notebook. Times, distances, angles, the sequence of shots, the logic behind each target. If they were going to court-martial him, at least there would be a record of why. Tony sat beside him. Sarge, why the third vehicle first? Sullivan looked up. You ever pull a thread from a sweater, Tony? You don't pull from the end. You pull from the middle and watch it unravel. Is that what we did? Sullivan looked at the mathematical perfection of destruction he had created. Yeah, Tony, that's what we did. Snow began falling again, covering the burning vehicles, the scattered equipment, nature attempting to hide what mankind had done. In the distance, more American vehicles approached. With them would come questions, investigations, consequences. The crossroads was saved. 12,000 Americans would live to fight another day. All because one sergeant from Nebraska had looked at a German column and seen not an insurmountable threat, but a mathematical problem waiting to be solved. Chuatoi moi viaggio kwang ishturban sen tu tronkieu kola tubi lefenser tu chopan one. Jatoi tiepto kwan than pan one. The farmhouse that would determine Sullivan's fate had once sheltered a Belgian family through generations of seasons. Now it sheltered Captain Hartley's field headquarters, its walls pocked with bullet holes, its elegant stonework cracked by artillery. Sullivan could smell coffee brewing somewhere, mixing oddly with cordite and winter air. 900 hours. Sullivan stood at attention, his notebook in hand, watching Hartley read the after-action report for the third time. Lieutenant Crawford stood by the window, occasionally glancing at the smoke still rising from the destroyed column visible in the distance. 14 vehicles. Hartley finally said, his Boston accent sharp as winter ice. You destroyed 14 vehicles. Yes, sir. By yourself. My crew assisted, sir. Hartley set down the report. Sergeant Sullivan, do you understand what you've done? I violated direct orders, sir. You also saved 12,000 American lives. Hartley walked to the window. The German prisoners are telling interesting stories. They claim they were attacked by an entire battery. 6, maybe 8 guns. They're wrong, sir. I know they're wrong. We found one set of tracks, but their commander insists no single gun could have done this. Says it's mathematically impossible. Sullivan thought about explaining the mathematics that made it not only possible, but inevitable. But these were officers who thought in terms of units and doctrine, not angles and timing. The door opened. Master Sergeant Paul Novak entered, his face carved from decades of military service. Sir Colonel Patterson's here. Colonel George Patterson looked like every recruitment poster come to life. 53 years old, West Point class of 1914, he had the bearing of someone who had never doubted an order in his life. Until today. He stood among the destroyed vehicles, counting wrecks, noting positions. Magnificent, he said. Absolutely magnificent. Sullivan stood with his crew beside their M10. Tony had tried cleaning soot from his face, but only created patterns. Frank stood at attention so rigidly he might have been frozen. Pete somehow managed to look both proud and terrified. Sergeant Sullivan walked me through the engagement. Sullivan did keeping to Hartley's sanitized version. Detected at observation post. Forced to engage. Destroyed enemy column in self-defense. Patterson listened, occasionally interrupting. Why that firing sequence? How did you maintain accuracy while repositioning? With each answer, something shifted in Patterson's expression. Sergeant, have you heard of force multiplication? No, sir. It's the idea that through superior tactics, a smaller force achieves disproportionate effects. What you did here, one gun achieving what should have required a full battery, that's force multiplication of the highest order. He turned to Hartley. I'm reassigning Sergeant Sullivan. Sullivan's stomach dropped. Reassignment could mean anything. Division is forming a special unit. Tank destroyer teams trained in what we're calling asymmetric engagement. I want Sullivan training them. Sir, I'm not an instructor. You are now. What you did here isn't in any manual, but it works. Can you teach others to see what you see? Sullivan thought about it. Could he teach someone to see warfare as mathematics? I can try, sir. Good. Report to division headquarters tomorrow. Bring your notebook. That evening, Sullivan sat in a requisition barn trying to write home. Around him, soldiers cleaned weapons, played cards, continued the routine of war. Word had spread through the battalion. Soldiers he'd never spoken to approached him, wanting to hear about the destroyed column. Heard you took out 20 tanks, a corporal said. 14 vehicles, not all tanks, Sullivan corrected. Tony Kowalski had drawn a crowd with his version. You should have seen it. Sarge looked at them and just knew. Like watching a chess master except the pieces exploded. Sullivan tried to concentrate on his letter. Dear Mother, I hope this finds you well. Today something happened that I cannot fully describe. He stopped. How could he explain to his mathematics teacher mother that her lessons in pattern recognition had become a weapon, that the gift she nurtured for seeing underlying structures now let him see exactly how to destroy? Frank Morrison sat beside him. What do you tell them, family, I mean? About days like today? The truth would terrify them. Lies feel wrong. Hell of a job today, Sarge. When you gave the order to fire, knowing it was against regulations, why did you think we'd follow? Sullivan considered. I didn't think. I just knew you would. Why? Because you saw what I saw, that doing nothing was worse than violating orders. Morrison nodded. My old man worked the Ford factory 30 years, followed every rule, got laid off when the Depression hit, died broke. Rules are fine when they make sense. When they don't, when following them means watching good people die, then fuck the rules. Pete Wilson approached with a liberated bottle. Medicinal purposes. They sat in comfortable silence, passing the bottle, watching snow fall through gaps in the barn roof. Outside, vehicles moved orders, were shouted the machinery of war ground forward. But inside their small circle, there was peace. We're going to be famous, Tony said. The Ghost Battery, that's what everyone's calling it. We're not a battery, Sullivan pointed out. Doesn't matter. Stories don't care about accuracy. Sullivan thought about that word Captain Zimmerman had used, impossible. The German had called it mathematically impossible. Patterson suggested it should have been doctrinally impossible. But it had happened, which meant it was never impossible, just unimaginable. In the corner of the barn, Sullivan could hear other soldiers talking. Stories already growing, changing. By tomorrow, the story would be that he had destroyed 20 tanks. By next week, 30. The truth would be lost in legend. But Sullivan had his notebook. Every shot recorded, every angle calculated. The mathematical proof that one gun could do what doctrine said required many. He turned to a fresh page and began writing his mother again. Dear Mother, do you remember when you taught me about load-bearing structures in architecture? How removing one support in the right place could bring down an entire building? Today I learned that military formations work the same way. I cannot tell you details, but your lessons saved lives today. Many lives. I hope that brings you some comfort knowing that the mathematics you taught me has purpose here, even if that purpose is terrible. Your son Marcus. He sealed the letter knowing the censors would read it, knowing they would find nothing actionable in a son telling his mother about mathematics. The next morning brought consequences. Sullivan was ordered to pack his gear. His crew would be reassigned. The Ghost Battery was being disbanded before it had ever officially existed. Tony was furious. We're the best gun crew in the battalion, and they're splitting us up. We're splitting up because we're good, Sullivan explained. They need us to teach others. I don't want to teach. I want to fight with you calling the shots. Sullivan handed Tony his notebook. Page 37. I drew out the engagement. Study it. Learn it. You'll be calling shots yourself soon. Frank Morrison was philosophical. Maybe this is better. Lightning doesn't strike twice. Pete Wilson said nothing, but that night he gave Sullivan a piece of twisted metal. From the Tiger. Figured you should have something to remember. Sullivan turned the fragment over in his hands. Once part of the most feared tank in the German arsenal, now just scrap. Destroyed not by superior firepower, but by superior thinking. At dawn, Sullivan climbed into a jeep bound for division headquarters. As they drove past the destroyed column now covered in fresh snow, he saw American engineers already clearing the road. The burned vehicles would be pushed aside, the road, reopened, the evidence of his violation of orders gradually erased. But the crossroads remained in American hands. Supply trucks were already rolling through carrying ammunition and food to the 28th Infantry Division. 12,000 soldiers would fight another day because one sergeant from Nebraska had chosen mathematics over orders. The Ardennes offensive would continue for weeks. History would record it as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest American battle of the war. But at one critical crossroads, the German advance had been stopped not by armies or artillery, but by one man who understood that war stripped of its glory and horror was ultimately a problem of angles and timing. And sometimes solving that problem required breaking the rules. Division headquarters occupied a Belgian school that had seen better centuries. The walls, once covered with children's drawings and multiplication tables, now displayed military maps bristling with pins and acetate overlays. Sullivan stood in what had been a classroom chalk dust still visible on the floor, facing 6 tank destroyer commanders, who looked at him with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. "So you're the ghost," Staff Sergeant Rick Anderson said. 35 years old North Africa veteran with eyes that had seen too much desert in death. The one who supposedly took out 14 vehicles solo. Not solo. "My crew was essential," Sullivan replied. "Still, 14 vehicles." Anderson's tone suggested he was waiting for Sullivan to admit it was exaggeration. Major Thomas Bradley entered before Sullivan could respond. Young for a major at 30, with the intense energy of someone who had traded sleep for ambition since West Point. "Gentlemen, you're here because you've shown exceptional ability in armored combat, but we're not here to praise past accomplishments. We're here to learn a new way of fighting." He pulled down a map of the Ardennes. "The Germans have better tanks, better guns, superior armor. We cannot match them in direct engagement, but Sergeant Sullivan has demonstrated we don't need to." Bradley turned to face them. "Standard doctrine says tank destroyers operate in platoons minimum. Standard doctrine says engage at maximum range, then withdraw." Sergeant Sullivan violated all these principles and achieved unprecedented success. Anderson raised a hand. "Sir, one success doesn't invalidate doctrine." "You're right, which is why we're going to test it. Each of you will take your crews through scenarios based on Sullivan's engagement. We'll see if his methods can be replicated." Sullivan wanted to object. His methods weren't methods. They were responses to specific circumstances, mathematical solutions to unique problems. But he remained silent. "Sergeant Sullivan will work with each crew," Bradley continued. "You have 3 days to learn what he knows. Make them count." The first training session was a disaster. Sullivan stood at a makeshift blackboard drawing angles and trajectories. "The key is understanding that every military formation has structural weak points. If you can identify them—" "This is combat, not geometry class," interrupted Sergeant Carl Hoffman, a Texan who wore his disdain like a badge. "When tigers are shooting at you, there's no time for calculations." "That's exactly when calculations matter most," Sullivan replied. "Look when you see a German column. What do you see?" "Targets," Anderson said. "Threats," offered another. "I see a structure," Sullivan said, drawing on the board. "Like a building or a bridge. It has load-bearing elements. Remove them in the right sequence, and the whole thing collapses." He drew a German column formation. They always deploy the same way. Heavy armor, front infantry, middle support, rear. It's doctrine. They trust it absolutely. That predictability is their weakness. "So we shoot the lead tank," Hoffman said, impatient. "No, that's what they expect. You shoot the third vehicle here at a terrain bottleneck. Now the lead elements can't reverse past this point, and everything behind is trapped." Slowly, painfully, some began to understand. Not the mathematics, but the concept. That military formations were structures that could be systematically dismantled rather than randomly attacked. By the second day, Sullivan had abandoned trying to teach calculations. Instead, he focused on pattern recognition. He set up model vehicles on a sand table, creating scenarios. "German commander confidence shows in spacing," he explained, moving the models. "Tight formation means they feel secure. Spread out means they expect contact. Watch for external fuel cans, they indicate supply status. Antenna configurations tell you which vehicles have radios." Sergeant Jake Williams, youngest of the group at 24, suddenly spoke up. "So it's like reading poker tells." "Exactly. Every formation tells a story. Your job is to read it, then exploit it." On the second afternoon, something clicked for Anderson. He was studying a formation Sullivan had arranged when he suddenly rearranged the models. "If I hit this half-track first, the infantry dismounts here in the open. Then the fuel truck creating smoke and confusion. Then the lead tank, while they're disoriented, Why that sequence? Sullivan asked. Because, Anderson paused thinking, because it creates cascading problems. Each shot makes the next more effective. Yes, Sullivan felt the satisfaction his mother must have felt when students finally grasped a difficult concept. By evening, 3 of the 6 sergeants were beginning to see formations as puzzles to be solved rather than forces to be fought. They stayed late arranging and rearranging model vehicles, debating sequences, arguing about angles. Major Bradley observed from the doorway. It's working, he told Sullivan quietly. For some, others still think I'm teaching them to dance when they should be learning to fight. Maybe that's what modern warfare is, a deadly dance where knowing the steps matters more than strength. That night, Sullivan received unexpected visitors. 3 German prisoners from the destroyed column brought for interrogation. Among them was Captain Klaus Zimmermann. Zimmermann was 41 years old, Iron Cross first-class veteran of Poland, France, and Russia. He sat across from Sullivan in the interrogation room, studying him with eyes that held professional interest rather than hatred. "So you are the Ghost Battery," Zimmermann said in accented but precise English. "Just a sergeant who got lucky." Zimmermann laughed bitterly. "Lucky 14 times no. I've been studying your attack. The targeting sequence, the timing. It was elegant. You speak like an engineer. I was before the war, Munich Technical Institute, which is why I know what you did required calculation, not luck." Zimmermann leaned forward. "How did you know our formation would collapse in that specific sequence?" Sullivan considered his answer. "Your doctrine is predictable. Vehicles always in the same order, same spacing. It's efficient but rigid. Rigidity can be calculated." "And calculation can be countered," Zimmermann replied. "Next time we won't be so predictable. There won't be a next time for you. For me, no. But others will learn. Your trick will only work until we adapt." After Zimmermann was taken away, Sullivan sat alone thinking. The German was right. Once the enemy understood the pattern, they would change their formations. The advantage would be temporary, but temporary advantages could still save lives. The 3rd day of training brought a revelation. Sullivan had set up a complex scenario on the sand table. When Sergeant Williams suddenly said, "This is backwards." "What do you mean?" "We're thinking about this wrong. Instead of reacting to their formation, why not force them into the formation we want?" Williams began moving models. "If we disable this vehicle here, not to destroy the column, but to make them deploy in a way that creates better targets." Sullivan stared at the table. Williams was right. He had been teaching them to exploit existing patterns. Williams was suggesting they create the patterns. "My God," Anderson breathed. "We could herd them, like sheep into a pen." The room erupted in discussion. Sergeants who had been skeptical now crowded around the table, suggesting variations improvements. The concept evolved from Sullivan's reactive mathematics to something proactive, aggressive. Major Bradley returned to find them still working past midnight. "Gentlemen, what's happening here?" Anderson looked up, eyes bright with excitement. "Sir, we're not just learning to destroy formations. We're learning to control them." Bradley looked at Sullivan. "Is this what you intended?" "No, sir. This is better. They're taking the concept beyond what I imagined." "Can it be codified, turned into doctrine?" Sullivan watched the sergeants working, teaching each other, building on ideas. "Not as rigid doctrine, sir. More like principles. Flexible principles that adapt to circumstances. Write it up, all of you. I want a manual by week's end." As the sergeants dispersed to their quarters, Anderson approached Sullivan. "I owe you an apology. I thought you were some glory hound with a lucky story." "What changed your mind?" "Realizing you weren't trying to make us copies of you. You were teaching us to think differently." Anderson paused. "That's harder and more valuable." Over the next days, word of the training spread. Officers from other units began appearing observing. A colonel from Patton's Third Army watched a demonstration and immediately requested Sullivan for a temporary assignment. "Absolutely not," Bradley responded. "He's too valuable here." But Sullivan was beginning to feel like a commodity rather than a soldier. Everyone wanted him to teach their unit, brief their staff, demonstrate his methods. The mathematical precision that had saved the crossroads was being turned into military bureaucracy. Then came news that changed everything. German radio intercepts indicated they were modifying their tactical doctrine. Columns were being instructed to maintain wider spacing, vary their formations, post vehicles, specifically to counter the ghost battery tactics. They're adapting, Bradley told Sullivan, faster than expected. Good tactics always generate counterattacks, sir. So what do we do? Sullivan thought about Williams' insight about forcing enemies into disadvantageous formations, rather than just exploiting existing ones. We evolve too. We stay ahead. That evening, Sullivan wrote in his notebook, "The Germans call it the ghost battery incident. They're right about one thing. Ghosts are hard to fight because they're not what they seem. We were never a battery. We were an idea. And ideas are harder to kill than tanks." A week later, the first Sullivan teams were deployed. Not copies of his methods, but variations, adaptations. Each team developed their own approach based on the principles Sullivan had demonstrated. Some focused on creating crossfire zones that forced enemy movement. Others specialized in ammunition selection to create specific effects. Reports began coming in. Near Hofeliz, a single tank destroyer disabled a company of Panthers by targeting their fuel trucks, first leaving the tanks immobile when they ran dry. At Clerf, another team created an artificial minefield using destroyed vehicles, channeling German forces into a kill zone. But there were failures too. A team near Wiltz attempted Sullivan's pattern against a German column that had adopted new spacing. They destroyed 3 vehicles but were overwhelmed when the Germans adapted mid-battle. 2 American crews were lost. Sullivan felt each loss personally. His innovation was saving lives, but also costing them when misapplied. He requested permission to return to combat duty. "Denied," Colonel Patterson told him flatly. "You're too valuable as an instructor." "Sir, with respect, I'm teaching tactics the enemy is already countering." "Then develop new tactics. That's your job now." Sullivan realized he had become trapped by his own success. The sergeant who had violated orders to save lives was now under orders to stay safe, while others died testing his theories. That night, he found an unexpected visitor in his quarters. Pete Wilson, his former driver, had managed to visit during a supply run. "Pete," Sullivan grabbed his hand. "How's the crew?" "Split up like you said. Tony's teaching spotting techniques. Frank's with a maintenance unit, showing them quick loading methods." Pete paused. "We all missed the rhythm we had." "Any word on new tactics from the Germans?" "Yeah, and it's working. They're using decoy vehicles now. Dummy tanks that look real from distance. You hit what you think is a fuel truck, turns out it's empty. Meanwhile, the real column is maneuvering on you." Sullivan's mind immediately began working on counters to the counters. "What about thermal signatures? Real engines run hot." "Already thought of that, did you?" Pete smiled. "That's why they need you teaching, not fighting. You see 3 moves ahead." After Pete left, Sullivan sat with his notebook sketching new formations, new patterns. The Germans were adapting, but adaptation itself followed patterns. If he could predict their adaptations, he worked through the night-filling pages with diagrams and calculations. By dawn, he had developed what he would later call dynamic pattern recognition, the ability to identify not just current formations, but predict their evolution under stress. The next morning, he presented his findings to Bradley and Patterson. "The Germans are teaching their crews to recognize our targeting patterns, but that teaching itself creates new patterns we can exploit." He demonstrated on the sand table. "They're spacing vehicles wider to prevent chain destruction, but wider spacing means longer columns, which means more vulnerability to flanking. They're varying formations to prevent prediction, but variation requires communication, and communication vehicles have identifiable signatures." Patterson studied the demonstration. "You're saying we can use their adaptations against them?" "Yes, sir. Every counter-tactic creates new vulnerabilities. We just need to recognize them faster than they recognize ours." "How do we teach this? It seems to require your particular insight." Sullivan had been thinking about this. "We don't teach solutions, sir. We teach soldiers to see problems. Once they see the problem clearly, solutions become obvious." Bradley was skeptical. "That's very philosophical for combat training." "Combat is philosophy with explosives, sir. The side that thinks better wins." Over the following weeks, Sullivan's training evolved from teaching specific tactics to teaching pattern recognition itself. He used puzzles, games, even music to help soldiers understand rhythm and disruption. One exercise involved arranging matchsticks in patterns, then asking soldiers to remove specific ones to cause collapse. Another used chess, but with modified rules that rewarded sacrificing pieces in specific sequences. Gradually, soldiers began seeing warfare differently, not as chaos to be survived, but as patterns to be recognized and exploited. The impact was measurable. Tank destroyer units trained in Sullivan's methods showed 30% better kill ratios than traditional units. More importantly, their survival rates improved by nearly 40%. But the Germans continued adapting too. They developed the Sullivan Protocol-specific counterattacks for American tank destroyers. Columns began including dedicated hunter units whose sole job was identifying and eliminating tank destroyers attempting pattern attacks. The war was becoming a chess match of adaptation and counter-adaptation, each side trying to think one move ahead. And at the center of it was a sergeant from Nebraska who had never wanted to be anything more than an engineer. One evening in late January 1945, Sullivan received a letter from his mother. She had heard through the mysterious ways families always hear things that her son had done something significant. She didn't know what exactly, but she was proud. She wrote, "Whatever you've done, whatever you've discovered, remember that knowledge itself is neither good nor evil. It's how we use it that matters. Use yours to bring this terrible war to an end and come home safely." Sullivan folded the letter carefully and placed it in his notebook between the page showing his first calculations from December 19th and his latest theoretical work on pattern evolution. His mother was right, as she usually was. Knowledge was neutral. But in war, neutral knowledge saved lives or ended them based on who understood it first. February 1945 brought mud to the Ardennes. The snow that had hidden so much death now melted, revealing the scarred earth beneath. Sullivan stood in a reclaimed Belgian schoolyard, watching new tank destroyer crews practice his evolving tactics. They were younger now, some barely 18, trying to master in days what had taken him months to understand. The war had changed. The German offensive had been broken, turned into retreat, but retreat made them more dangerous, not less. Desperate enemies were unpredictable enemies, and unpredictability was the enemy of pattern recognition. "Sergeant Sullivan," a voice called. He turned to see Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Matthews, a man he had never met but whose reputation preceded him. Matthews had been Patton's planning officer before being assigned to study and implement what they were now calling asymmetric armored doctrine. "Sir," Sullivan saluted. "Walk with me, Sergeant." Matthews led him away from the training ground. "I've been reading your reports. Fascinating stuff. But I have a question that's not in any report. Sir, that morning, December 19th, when you fired without orders, what made you pull the trigger?" Really, Sullivan considered lying, giving the sanitized version, but something in Matthews' eyes suggested he wanted truth. "I saw 12,000 Americans dying, sir, and I saw a mathematical solution to prevent it. The choice was between certain catastrophe and possible court-martial. So you chose court-martial." "I chose mathematics, sir. Court-martial was just a possible side effect." Matthews laughed, surprising Sullivan. "You know what you've really done, don't you? You've proven that individual initiative can trump doctrine. That's either the most valuable or most dangerous lesson of this war." They walked past recovered German vehicles now being studied by American engineers. Among them was the Tiger from Sullivan's engagement, its armor still scorched. "The Germans have a new name for you," Matthews said. "Der Mustermann, the pattern man. They're teaching their tank crews to watch for pattern recognition attacks." "I know, sir. We've been developing counters." "That's the problem, Sergeant. We're in an adaptation race, each side trying to outthink the other. But wars aren't won by thinking. They're won by logistics, numbers, industrial capacity." Sullivan understood what Matthews was really saying. His tactical innovation had tactical value, but the war would be won by strategic factors beyond any individual's control. "Are you telling me my work doesn't matter, sir?" "I'm telling you it matters more than you realize. Your tactics have saved hundreds of American crews. But more importantly, you've changed how we think about armored warfare. That change will outlast this war." That afternoon, Sullivan received unexpected orders. He was to report to a captured German command post where something significant had been discovered. He arrived to find intelligence officers examining documents with expressions of disbelief. Captain David Marks, an intelligence officer who spoke fluent German, showed Sullivan a Wehrmacht training manual dated January 1945. Look at this. It's their new anti-tank destroyer doctrine. The whole thing is about countering you specifically. Sullivan read the translated sections. The Germans had analyzed his December 19th engagement in extraordinary detail, reconstructing each shot timing angle. They had developed mathematical models predicting his targeting sequences. They were teaching crews to recognize Sullivan patterns and respond with specific maneuvers. "They've turned you into doctrine," Marx said. "You're probably the only sergeant in history to have enemy field manuals written about him." But something in the manual troubled Sullivan. The Germans hadn't just analyzed his past tactics. They had predicted his future ones. Some of the patterns they described were ones Sullivan had only recently developed, not yet used in combat. "They're not just reacting," he told Marx. "They're anticipating. Someone on their side thinks like I do." Over the next days, Sullivan studied captured German documents, looking for signs of his counterpart. He found them in the precise mathematics, the elegant solutions, the way problems were framed. Somewhere in the Wehrmacht was another pattern thinker, someone teaching German crews to see warfare through the same mathematical lens. Then came confirmation. A prisoner interrogation revealed that Major Ernst Kellner, former professor of mathematics at Heidelberg University, had been assigned to develop counter-tactics for American tank destroyer teams. Kellner had apparently become obsessed with Sullivan's engagement, calling it the most elegant tactical solution of the war. Sullivan requested Kellner's writings. What he found astonished him. Kellner hadn't just analyzed Sullivan's tactics. He had extended them, developed variations Sullivan hadn't considered. In academic language dense with mathematical proofs, Kellner described warfare as a series of solvable equations where human behavior could be predicted through probability matrices. "He's right," Sullivan told Matthews, "but he's also wrong. He treats soldiers as constants in equations. They're variables, unpredictable variables." "Can you counter his counters?" Sullivan smiled grimly. "I can do better. I can make his precision work against him." He developed what he called chaos injection, deliberately introducing random elements into patterns to make them unpredictable. Crews were taught to roll dice before engagements, using the results to modify their tactics in ways that couldn't be anticipated. The first test came near Prum. A tank destroyer team encountered a German column using Kellner's defensive formation. Instead of following predictable targeting sequences, they used Sullivan's chaos system. The randomization confused German crews expecting specific patterns. The engagement was a complete American success, but success brought scrutiny. In early March, Sullivan was summoned to Schiaff headquarters in Rams. He found himself in a room with more brass than he had ever seen, including generals he had only heard about in newsreels. General Courtney Hodges, 1st Army commander, spoke first. "Sergeant, we've been following your work, the tactical innovations, the training programs, the theoretical developments. It's impressive. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. We have a problem. The Germans have put a price on your head, 20,000 Reichsmarks for the soldier who kills der Mustermann. You're being specifically targeted." Sullivan hadn't known this. The idea that enemy soldiers were hunting him personally was unsettling. "We're pulling you from the theater," Hodges continued. "You'll return to the States' work with the armor school at Fort Knox. Your war is over." "Sir, with respect, my work here isn't finished. Your work here has become too dangerous. You're more valuable alive in Kentucky than dead in Germany." But Sullivan never made it to Kentucky. On March 15th, while traveling to a rear area for transportation home, his convoy was hit by German artillery. Not targeted at him specifically, just random shells falling on a crossroads. Sullivan was thrown from his jeep, suffered a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and shrapnel wounds to his left leg. He woke in a field hospital to find Tony Kowalski sitting beside his bed. "Can't leave you alone for 5 minutes," Tony said, but his eyes were wet. "How bad?" Sullivan asked. "You'll walk, maybe with a limp, but you're done fighting." As Sullivan recovered, he learned the war was approaching its end. German resistance was collapsing. The patterns he had spent months studying were dissolving into chaos as the Wehrmacht disintegrated. From his hospital bed, he continued working, writing what would become the foundation of post-war armored warfare doctrine. He corresponded with tank destroyer crews receiving reports of engagements, analyzing successes and failures. One letter particularly moved him. It was from Sergeant Anderson, who had been so skeptical during training. Sullivan. Anderson wrote, "Used your methods yesterday, destroyed an entire SS Panzer company with 3 tank destroyers. My gunner, a kid from Iowa, saw the pattern immediately. Said it was like solving a puzzle. We lost no one. The kid says he learned more from 3 days with you than 3 months of regular training. You saved his life, and he doesn't even know you." On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Sullivan was still in the hospital now in England. He listened to the celebration outside the church bells, ringing, people singing. But all he could think about was the mathematics of it all. How many lives had been saved by pattern recognition? How many lost when patterns failed? Captain Marks visited him the next day with extraordinary news. "We found Kellner. He survived the war. He wants to meet you." The German mathematician. "Yes, he's in a prisoner camp, but he's been writing. He says he has theoretical work that extends your concepts. Says together you could revolutionize military science." Sullivan thought about it. Meeting the enemy who had studied him, countered him, perhaps understood him better than his own commanders. "Arrange it," he said. The meeting took place in a sterile room at the prisoner camp. Ernst Kellner was 43 years old, thin from privation, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Sergeant Sullivan," he said in accented English, "the ghost battery himself. Major Kellner, the man who almost figured me out." They sat across from each other, 2 pattern thinkers who had dueled with mathematics across a battlefield. "Your December action," Kellner began. "It was beautiful, elegant. When I first analyzed it, I thought it must have been planned for weeks. Then I realized it was spontaneous. That's when I knew I was dealing with a true mathematician. You came close to stopping me. Close doesn't matter in war or mathematics." Kellner pulled out a worn notebook. "I've been working on something, a generalized theory of tactical pattern recognition. May I show you?" For the next 3 hours, they discussed warfare as abstract mathematics. Kellner's work was brilliant, extending Sullivan's practical innovations into theoretical frameworks that could apply to any combat situation. "Why are you sharing this with me?" Sullivan asked. "Because mathematics has no nationality. What we discovered separately and against each other belongs to human knowledge. The war is over. Perhaps our work can prevent future wars from being so costly." Sullivan wasn't sure war could ever be prevented, but perhaps it could be made less wasteful. He and Kellner continued corresponding after Kellner's repatriation to Germany. Together they wrote papers that would influence military thinking for decades. In July 1945, Sullivan finally returned to Nebraska. He was discharged as a technical sergeant with a Distinguished Service Cross Purple Heart and a permanent limp. The citation for his DSC mentioned extraordinary tactical innovation, but gave no specifics. The December 19th engagement remained classified. His mother met him at the train station in Omaha. She looked older, grayer, but her eyes were the same sharp instruments that had taught him to see patterns in everything. "You're limping," she observed. "Artillery, random shell, no pattern to predict." She hugged him, then fierce and protective. "Random doesn't mean meaningless. You're home. That's all that matters." Sullivan returned to Scottsbluff, tried to return to normal life. But normal had changed. He couldn't look at traffic without seeing movement patterns. Couldn't watch birds flock without calculating optimal formations. The war had rewired his brain permanently. He used his GI benefits to attend university studying engineering, as he had always planned. But his professors found him unsettling. He would solve complex problems, instantly seeing solutions others needed hours to calculate. When asked to explain, he would say, "It's just patterns." In 1947, the Army contacted him. They were establishing the Armor School's Advanced Tactical Training Center. Would he consider a civilian position, developing curriculum? Sullivan accepted. He spent the next 30 years teaching young officers to see warfare differently. His students included future generals who would command in Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. They learned pattern recognition, chaos, injection, adaptive thinking. But Sullivan never forgot the moment that started it all. December 19, 1944, when he chose mathematics over orders. He kept the twisted metal fragment from the Tiger tank on his desk, a reminder that sometimes the right choice was not the authorized choice. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, Sullivan was invited to a reunion in Belgium. He stood at the Clerf Crossroads, now a peaceful intersection with a gas station and a cafe. A small plaque marked the site of his engagement. Tony Kowalski was there, gray-haired and grandfather-like. Frank Morrison had died in 1976, but his son attended. Pete Wilson came from Oregon, still quiet, still observant. "You know what I remember most," Tony said. "The silence after. When you called ceasefire, it was like the world stopped." "The world did stop," Sullivan replied, "for 14 German vehicles. A car approached the intersection, slowed, proceeded through. Normal traffic following normal patterns. Sullivan watched it and saw not a car, but a point in space and time following predictable paths that could be calculated, disrupted, controlled." "Do you regret it?" Pete asked suddenly. "Violating orders?" Sullivan thought about the question he had been asked hundreds of times in different ways. "I regret that it was necessary, but necessity doesn't ask permission." That evening at the reunion dinner, Sullivan was asked to speak. He stood before the assembled veterans, these men who had survived when statistics said they shouldn't have. "We're called the greatest generation," he began, "but we weren't great. We were young and scared and doing our best with impossible situations. What made us special wasn't courage or patriotism. It was adaptation. We learned, evolved, survived, and sometimes we had to break rules to do it." He raised his glass. "To the ghosts of the ghost battery, to patterns recognized and patterns broken, to mathematics and chaos, to survival." Marcus Sullivan died in 2001 at age 79. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, his teaching career, his contributions to military science. It did not mention December 19, 1944. But at Fort Knox in the Armor School's Hall of Fame, there is a display, a notebook filled with mathematical calculations, a twisted piece of Tiger tank armor, and a simple plaque that reads, "Technical Sergeant Marcus Sullivan. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. 1 gun, 14 vehicles, 12,000 lives saved." Below that, in smaller text, his own words, "War is mathematics with consequences. The key is understanding which equations to solve and which rules to break." The ghost battery was never a battery. It was never about the guns. It was about seeing differently, thinking differently, and having the courage to act when action violated everything except necessity. And sometimes in war and in life, that makes all the difference.